Rosh Chodesh is still somewhat festive. There's even a machlokas. There are some shittas that actually say you're allowed to eat meat on Rosh Chodesh. We do not paskin that way, but it's still appropriate to give a Chodesh Tov. Also, Rosh Chodesh Av is quite literally the only yahrzeit that is explicitly stated in the Torah. Today is a very important yahrzeit. It is the yahrzeit of Aaron HaKohen. Aaron, we read it in last week's Parsha, Parshas Masai, was Nifter, Rosh Chodesh of Chodesh HaChamishi, Rosh Chodesh of the 5th month, and if you count from Nisan, Iyar Sivan, Tammuz Av, because all the months are counted from Nisan, Rosh Chodesh Av. Now, it's very, very interesting that we know Moshe Rabbeinu died on the 7th of Adar, but that's not in the Torah. We don't know exactly the yahrzeits of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and it's only Aaron whose yahrzeit is recorded. Now, Miriam, it happens to be, we also know that Miriam died Rosh Chodesh Nisan of the 40th year, but that's also not, it's recorded that she's died, but the date is not recorded. Aaron is quite literally the only yahrzeit. In fact, the only yahrzeit recorded in Tanakh generally. Now, so that's one interesting point. Another interesting point is the way the Torah records it is in a very odd way. Let me explain this. In Parshas Chukas, that is the 40th year, that is when Aaron dies. Aaron dies in Parshas Chukas. Why is it mentioned again in Parshas Masai? Because Parshas Masai is a list of the 42 stops that the Jewish people traveled from Ramses in Mitzrayim till the plains of Moab, which is the last stop. Now, here is the thing. If you look at the list of stops, the Torah normally does not describe in that listing any particular events that happened at that stop. It is just an itinerary. An are you okay? Did I hear?
Yeah, we got the mic back. Switch you real quick. No, everything was recorded, so you're fine.
I'm going to give you an outstanding example. It says in this list, they left Rephidim and they came to Midbar Sinai. And they left Midbar Sinai and they came to Kivros Hatava. Now, wait a second. Quite a lot of important stuff happened in Midbar Sinai, namely Matan Torah, Chet HaEgel, Hakamas HaMishkan. But the list is just telling you where they were and where they traveled to. It doesn't give you the history of the events, because that's in other places of the Torah. So it says, Vayisu Vayavo Midbar Sinai, Vayisu Mi Sinai, Vayachanu B'Kivros Hatava. Because Hatava is also important. That's where they ate the quail and they died. Which means Parshas Masai is supposed to be a bare bones list that does not really relate the events that happened. But then, as we continue in the stops, they came, this is the southeast corner of Israel, they came to Hor HaHor, kind of a mountain on top of a mountain. And Aaron died in Hor HaHor. And Aaron was 123 years old. And Aaron died the first day of the 5th month. That's a lot of detail. And not only is it a lot of detail, but it gives you a detail that we don't even know from Parshas Chukas when the event happened. Parshas Chukas does not say the date of Rosh Chodesh Adar. So the way Aaron's death is treated in last week's Parsha is totally out of sync with the kind of itinerary listing. I mean, as I say, if Midbar Sinai doesn't qualify for any mention of any event, they were in Midbar Sinai, they left Sinai. No mention of Matan Torah, Egel, Mishkan. So all of a sudden, when it comes to Aaron's death, the Torah goes into detail. Right? So it's a very interesting point. So Svarim HaKadoshim say the following, that the idea that why did Aaron die in the month of Av? Because Aaron represents the idea, spiritually, of Ohev Shalom V'Rodev Shalom, a lover of peace, a pursuer of peace. Aaron's death symbolically can be understood as a histalkus, a removal of those forces of peace and love and achdus and unity. So what happens when those forces of shalom and unity and avas Yisrael leave the world, we enter the month of Av, which is the month of destruction and sadness. Again, it's a remez to what Chazal later said, that the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam. Aaron dies, and you get the month of Av. And that's why the Torah goes into detail, because Parshas Masai is always read either, like this year, the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh Av, or in most years, the first Shabbos in the month of Av. And this is a time when we think about the causes for the Chorban Beis HaMikdash and how we can rectify it, how we can fix it. So we need to hear, when the Aarons leave the world, you get the Avs. Meaning when the Midah of Ohev Shalom, Brodev Shalom leaves the world, you get Chorban. And the Torah put it here rather than Chukas, because Chukas we read several weeks ago. The Torah wanted to put it precisely in the time of year when we have to be more conscious of this. That's why the Torah deferred what it should have stated in Parshas Chukas. It defers it to this Parsha, or last week's Parsha, because that is read right before Rosh Chodesh Av, or actually in the month of Av itself. Anyway, Aaron is buried southeast of Eretz Israel, kind of near the Jordanian, the border with Saudi Arabia, southeast of the Dead Sea. I don't know if we're 100% sure. I mean, the Arabs have identified it, and there are Jews who make pilgrimages to it. There are Jews who... We can't visit Moshe Rabbeinu's kever, because the Torah says nobody knows where Moshe Rabbeinu is buried, although we know approximately where it is. But Aaron HaKohen, some people go to, and they daven at the kever of Aaron HaKohen. And certainly we have to try to live with his midah of Ohev Shalom, Brodev Shalom, to overcome the sinas chinam that is responsible for the Chorban Beis HaMikdash. So that was point number one, that this is a very important yahrzeit to think about, particularly in the month of Av. Point number two, I wanted to add a few details regarding the thing I said at the very end, the Machlokes, the Bavli, and the Yerushalmi, regarding how many brachos you have in Shmoneh Esrei. So it's the position of the Bavli, which is the way we normally understand it, that there were originally 18 brachos in Shmoneh Esrei, and therefore Shmoneh Esrei is the original number of brachos. But when Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne commissioned Shmuel HaKatan to compose the bracha against the heretics and the informers, that made 19. So if you take out your siddur and you count the brachos, you will see that there are 19 brachos in the weekday Shmoneh Esrei, and therefore Shmoneh Esrei is really a misnomer, and it's simply based on, it was originally 18 brachos. Now that is the Shitas Bavli, that we went from 18 to 19. Now the Yerushalmi has a shita that actually combines two brachos that the Bavli keeps as separate. We have in our Shmoneh Esrei a bracha asking Hashem to rebuild and bless Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim ircha barachamim tashuv, and that ends with brachata Hashem bonei Yerushalayim. And then we have another bracha which asks Hashem to restore the messianic line coming from David HaMelech, and that ends with Matzmiach Keren Yeshua, you cause the horn of salvation to sprout. And we have two separate brachas, one on Binyan Yerushalayim and one on Malchus Beis David and Mashiach. Now let me point out the following. Even the way we have it, that is two separate brachas, you see a bit of an unusual feature, and I hope you've noticed this. In the bracha Uvnei Yerushalayim, there is a reference, V'chisei David Avdecha Meheru L'socha Tachin. I mean, that kind of indicates that perhaps there was a joinder of the brachas at some point. Okay, but keep that aside. By the way, the Arizal writes, very counterintuitively, that when you pray, V'chisei David Meheru L'socha Tachin, may you reestablish very quickly the throne of David. The throne of David is actually a prayer for Mashiach ben Yosef, who will kind of be the throne, the precursor of Mashiach ben David. So that's not a prayer for Mashiach ben David. That's a prayer that the foundation of Mashiach ben David should come speedily. which is Mashiach ben Yosef. Okay, but putting that aside, I had mentioned that the Shitas Yerushalmi was that these two brachos were joined. The bracha of Yerushalayim and the bracha of Malchus Beis David were joined. So someone had asked me if we have the gears of that bracha. We do. So I'll read it to you. Maybe I'll make a copy if my eyes can read it. This is the version of the bracha in the Yerushalmi, which combines Yerushalayim Ircha and Es Samach David. And it says, it starts off a little bit like benching. Rachem Hashem Elokeinu Aleinu Val Yisrael Amecha V'al Yerushalayim Irecha V'al Tzion Mishkan Kavodecha V'al Malchus Beis David Mishichecha. Very similar to benching. And it ends, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokei David Ubonei Yerushalayim. The Elokei David is what later became Matzmiach Keren Yeshua, the prayer for Mashiach. So they had Baruch Atah Hashem Elokei David Ubonei Yerushalayim. Now, I want to clarify, because I didn't clarify this yesterday, so I want to say there are two different shitas how to understand the Yerushalmi. What I said yesterday was originally it was 17 because of this combination, and with V'lam al Shinim, it became 18. So like the Yerushalmi, Shmona Esrei is the accurate name for it today. But there's a second Shita in the Yerushalmi that originally it was 18 because the brachos were separated. When they added V'lam al Shinim, that's when the brachos were joined. In other words, there was a concept, according to this version of the Yerushalmi, that they want to have 18 brachos because it's Chayim. So according to this version, they always had 18. Before there was V'lam al Shinim, the brachos were separated. When they added V'lam al Shinim, that's when they were joined together. So it was 18 before V'lam al Shinim, right? So it turns out we have three shitas. According to the Talmud Bavli, it was originally 18 and then it became 19. According to the Talmud Yerushalmi version 1, it was originally 17 and then it became 18. And according to Yerushalmi version 2, it was originally 18 because the brachos were separated. When they added V'lam al Shinim, they joined the brachos. So it was 18 and it became 18 even afterwards because Chazal were wedded to the number 18. There was a certain significance in the number 18. So these are three different shitas. So according to the second pshat in the Yerushalmi, this bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokei David Ubonei Yerushalayim, became that only after Shmuel HaKatan added the bracha of V'lam al Shinim. By the way, one other interesting halacha, the Gemara says, if a chazan is saying Chazaras Hashatz, and he somehow gets confused, sometimes, maybe it's a mini stroke or whatever it is, a person doesn't know what to read, etc. So normally we, assuming he's healthy to continue, we wait for him, we allow him to correct himself, and he can go on. But it says if he makes a mistake in Birchas Haminim, we are afraid that he's actually a sectarian. He's one of those minim, so we pull him off. So the Gemara recounts a very fascinating story that Shmuel HaKatan was once a Shaliach Tzibor, and he specifically messed up in the Birchas Haminim, and they allowed him to continue. So the Gemara asks, isn't there the halacha that you have to pull the guy off? The answer is, well, he was the author of it, so we didn't really have to suspect that he didn't believe in what he wrote, so therefore it was going to be okay. Yeah.
Would the Shemona Esrei have to be changed with like the Kohen Mashiach or even the Kohen Mashiach ben Yosef? Would you have to
Yes. Now remember, just as I mentioned yesterday, the version that we have now is not the same thing the Anshe Knesset Agdola wrote, because they wrote it when there was a mikdash, and Shimon HaPakuli rewrote it when there's no mikdash. So once again, we're going to have to revise it again. The Sanhedrin will have to revise it. Okay. Now, one final point about this. Then I'm going to go on to something else. I had mentioned the beautiful thought of Rav Kook yesterday. Why was it necessary to have Shmuel HaKatan be the author of the bracha against Minim? So you'll recall that Rav Kook's answer was Because since this is the one bracha where we ask Hashem to curse and punish and destroy, we have to be motivated out of a love for the Jewish people and not out of a hatred, even for the bad people. In other words, some people would disagree, we don't hate Rishayim. We want to get rid of their influence so that God is honored and revered and that the Jewish people are able to fulfill their function. If that does mean that people have to be destroyed, that's going to be regrettable. But it's not a joy in the destruction it's themselves. So most people couldn't daven in that way. Shmuel HaKatan could, because his motto was the pasuk in Mishlei, as it says in Pirkei Avos, "Bin fol lo yivchal tismach," do not rejoice when your enemy falls. And Rav Kook said that is why Rabbi Gamliel chose him. So I just wanted to just add a little point from the Nefesh HaChaim, because you might say, well, wait a second, but when I daven, I hate Hamas and I hate Christian missionaries. So how can my prayer be accepted if I'm tainted with these negative kavanas? So here I think we have to supplement what Rav Kook said with something Rav Chaim Volozhiner said. Rav Chaim Volozhiner made the point in a mystical way that when the Anshe Knesset Hagdola compose, or even later, like Rabbi Gamliel, when they compose these prayers, they put into the prayers all sorts of wondrous kavanos. So even if I'm not even aware of those kavanos, and I don't have those kavanos, when I latch onto the words carry me up to Shemayim because of the kavana they put into the words. So I think that explains Rav Kook's point as well, and that is Shmuel HaKatan was machnis into V'lamalshinim, a selfless love for Am Yisrael, and not a hatred of the bad guys. So even if when I daven, I can't get rid of that hatred, but my prayer is payel, my prayer works because of the kavanos that, in this case, it's not the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, it's Shmuel HaKatan, who was as worthy as Moshe Rabbeinu. You'll recall to have the Shekhinah rest. So that's kind of a way out, meaning it's not so much taloi on my individual kavanos. In fact, very often we have no kavana at all. It's totally on connecting to the words in which these great kavanas were put. That's one of the arguments about the old shaila, can you daven in other languages? Now, the halacha is very, very clear that you are permitted to daven Shemona Esrei in any language. You can daven in English, French, Chinese, whatever language you understand. So the question is, so why don't we just, so today we have translations, it's a lot easier, but in days when there weren't translations and a lot of people didn't understand Hebrew, even if they could read it, why don't we just daven in English? Like why do we even bother to daven in Hebrew if English is more understandable? And part of the answer mystically is that in the Hebrew words, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola were machnes, all sorts of wondrous kavanos. Now, those wondrous kavanos may not be carried forth necessarily in the translations. So the translations pick up the simple meaning of the words, but it doesn't necessarily pick up all of the hidden meanings. So, although avada you are yotze, but it is better to daven in Hebrew. And then, people always have the question. It's a difficult question, and it's a very commonly asked question. Well, here's my choice. I can daven in Hebrew without understanding what I'm saying, or I can daven in English and I can understand what I'm saying. So what is better, Hebrew without understanding or English with understanding? Now, in some ways, that is a false binary selection of options, simply because today with translations, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have Hebrew and look at the English. But let's assume theoretically you have this question. This is my choice. Hebrew without, English with. That is a very hard question because on the other hand, kavana is so important in davening. And if the Hebrew without understanding, you don't have kavana, even though you're latching on to the hidden kavanas, but consciously there's no kavana. So that would argue in favor of English. On the other end, English lacks all of those hidden kavanas. So there's no real definitive answer that's given for this. Basically, a person will be encouraged to daven in Hebrew, but every once in a while in order to recharge his batteries. he'll be told every third prayer or every or twice a week, daven in English. It's actually very similar to a related question. It's not really related, but it's the same type of dilemma where people sometimes say, I have more kavana when I don't daven with a minyan. When I daven by myself, I can take my time. I can think about what I'm saying. I'm not hurried. I'm not rushed. I come to minyan, even the yeshiva minyan, which is slower than the average show, but and Kal V'chomer, the average show, everybody's rushing. And some people say, even if it's a slow minyan, when I'm surrounded by people, I can't concentrate the same way. Okay, it's legitimate. I get that. So here's the question. If the ikar of tefillah is kavana, then why should I go to minyan if I have less kavana? So once again, the halachic answer is that tefillah b'tzibor overrides tefillah with more kavana. But the Chazon Ish said in somewhat of a subjective way, he gave reshus for a person who's functioning that way, that once or twice a month, he can decide not to go to minyan to kind of have an intense kavana experience. So I think davening with English is somewhat going to be of a similar. Now, of course, if you don't know how to read Hebrew, then of course you're davening in English. But if you know how to read, but you don't understand what you're saying, so I think I'm drawing an analogy. I'm not sure if it's completely an analogy to what the Chazon Ish said about davening b'yachidus. I would say davening in English is kind of the same problem, that sometimes you do have to sacrifice the optimal kavana for either minyan or lashon hakodesh, but at the same time, you're given a certain leeway to take time off to enhance your kavana in that particular way. So it is a hard question because very often when we try to do things in one right way, where we're sacrificing something else, that's kind of one of the dilemmas in Ruchnius that people often face. Okay, did you want to say anything?
Do we know which tefillas are from Ashkenaz and which ones are from Rabbi Shimon? What's his name?
Hapakuli?
Hapakuli, and do we know who authored each tefillah?
Well, we don't have each one, but usually you can figure it out, and that is anything that refers to rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash is from Shimon Hapakuli, because the Anshe Knesset Agdola had a Beis Hamikdash. So any references to Golos is later. It's not that he added brachos; he simply revised the existing. Remember, the existing number of brachos minus V'lo Malshinim does go back to the Anshe Knesset Agdola, but he had to revise it to take account of the changed circumstances. Yeah.
After the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, was there an understanding that at some point there would be a destruction?
Yes, it was understood. In fact, we looked at this in the book of Ezra itself. It was understood that the second Mikdash would eventually be destroyed. And in fact, the Rambam says an interesting thing. It's Nogea L'Maisa on Tisha B'Av. The Rambam says for the 420 years of the Second Temple, they fasted on the 9th of Av. Now, you might think that's a very odd thing. If the main fast of Tisha B'Av is because of the Chorban Beis Hamikdash, why would you fast on the 9th of Av when you have a Beis Hamikdash? And Rav Soloveitchik explains, because they knew this temple was going to be destroyed on the 9th of Av. They didn't know when. And every Tisha B'Av, there was this sense of foreboding, waiting, as the expression goes, for the other shoe to drop. So you're trying to suggest that maybe they built in the references to the Chorban? Yeah, but that is possible. It is possible that there was an element of prophetic, or at least knowing that this would be coming. But still, it would be odd to mandate that as a daily recitation, that when we have a temple, to talk about the temple being destroyed. So it's less likely. And once again, you do have to deal with the text that says Shimon HaPakuli wrote it. So we're using this to reconcile a stira, Anshe Knesset Agdola versus Shimon HaPakuli. I mentioned, I think Pakuli means a wool merchant. I think that's important. Even those professions, Tanoim, less so Amoram, but Tanoim are sometimes identified by their professions. And that's not one example is Rav Yochanan Hasandler. Rav Yochanan, this is not the famous Rav Yochanan the Amora, but Rav Yochanan the cobbler, the shoemaker. Shimon HaPakuli, Shimon the wool merchant. Rav Yeshua HaPachmi, he was a blacksmith. So why is it important to mention somebody's job? Why was that significant? So there might be two different reasons why they're significant. They do overlap. One is a reason that the Rambam himself gives in Hilchos Talmud Torah. And again, this Rambam is not widely followed today, but the Rambam writes it, and the Rambam writes it in several places, so he held to this very strongly, that one should not get money for the learning or teaching of Torah. This is godly work, and it is not something for which one gets compensation. And the Rambam points out that the great Chachamim of the Mishnah and the Gemara, they made their income from different occupations. Tailors, blacksmiths, and wool merchants, whatever it would be. And the Rambam, Hillel himself, although Hillel is not identified by a job, but Hillel was a woodcutter. And the Rambam makes the point that one should not be nanami divrei Torah. Now, obviously, the Kesef Mishnah already writes that in his time this was not followed, simply because unless people would get supported for the Torah learning, you wouldn't be able to produce Talmidei Chachamim. Okay, Beseder. So that's one idea, that this is kind of like the Rambam. The other idea is that maybe Chazal wanted to teach us that even if you're working, that doesn't stop you from being a Talmid Chacham. Meaning there's another lesson, and that is, one of the negative side effects of yeshiva, and this is a side effect, and maybe it's an unintentional side effect, but it is a side effect that may cause people trouble, is that if we absorb the idea that it's only full-time learning where you're really, really connecting to Hashem in your learning, and that's what's pushed, and that is described as the ideal. So the question becomes, how does a person relate when they're not in that full-time environment anymore? And sometimes what happens is a person might have the attitude, what's the point? What's the point of my learning an hour a day if it's only an hour a day and the rest of the day I'm wasting on Havle Olam Hazeh? So this is the famous statement they attribute to Voltaire: don't allow the best to become the enemy of the better. Meaning, I have an idea of best, and if I'm not doing best, what's the use? Very, very untrue. In fact, Rav Weinbach, that's how the co-founder with Rav Shiur, Zichron Livracha of Ohr Somayach, said, he had an expression which is very cute. He said, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. Now this is a nice little twist. The familiar saying is, anything worth doing is worth doing well. That's the familiar saying that maybe your mother told you. But he said, he put a twist on it. Anything worth doing is worth doing even badly, meaning we sometimes think, if I'm not going to do a perfect job, then what's the purpose? The answer is no. Learning an hour is a lot better than not learning an hour. Right? So if you have an hour, learn an hour. If you have 5 minutes, learn 5 minutes. And maybe Chazal wanted to identify very great rabbis by the fact that these were working class people, to kind of remind us that when we become part of the working class, whatever that means, that doesn't mean we abandon the Torah. That is an important lesson, because I have encountered it a number of times, that when people have left full-time learning in yeshiva, they do not pursue learning in a working environment, because they think, what's the use? What's the use? What's the use? I'm not doing Be'iyun, I'm not doing all the commentaries, I'm not, so it's super. I mean, this is the downside. In other words, if you have a Rebbe that's knocking, let's say, superficial learning or less Ian intensive learning, well, that's great when you have the opportunity to do Ian learning. But then what happens is a guy leaves yeshiva and his only opportunity is to do, let's say, non-Ian learning. So he says, well, I was told over 2 years that non-Ian learning is not worth anything. So what's going to be the result? Doesn't do anything. So as I say, these are not intentional negativities, but they are, I think, side effects that you need to watch yourself against. And Laniya Staiti, this might have been what Chazal were trying to do when they wanted to identify Shimon HaPakuli, the fellow who rewrote Shemona Esrei. He was not a full-time rabbi in Kollel. He was a wool merchant. By the way, the Arizal also had a parnas. Arizal died very young. Arizal died before 40. The Arizal was a pepper merchant. The reason why I say that is that, when we talk about Kisvei Ha'ari, the writings of the Ari, that's really a misnomer. We don't really have writings of the Ari. We have, from Rav Chaim Vital, he wrote over different teachings that he heard from the Ari and that other people heard from the Arizal. So Kisvei Ari really means largely the writings of Rav Chaim Vital telling us and explaining the teachings of the Ari, although it's called Kisvei Ari. So I believe the only Ksav Yad we have from the Ari, his actual writing, are not Svarim that he wrote, but his signature on a receipt for the purchase of pepper or spices. So we have to have Yitzchak Luria, we have his signature on that, which may be Min HaShamayim. It wants to remind us that even if you're in business, well, I'm not making the claim you can become the Arizal. That's not that likely, but the Arizal is the Arizal, even though he was involved in business as well, and that is an important lesson for people to learn. Okay, now again, I am going to get back to the book of Ezra, but as I say, once we get onto the Anshe Knesses Hagdola, there's a lot of digression here, and we've been talking about the fact that they were miyased the Shemona Esrei. So here I want to just mention, and I'll probably have to talk about it more next week in more detail, a very fundamental machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban about the mitzvah of tefillah, the mitzvah of praying to Hashem. Shitas HaRambam, Maimonides, in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, is that praying to Hashem every single day is a biblical commandment. It is one of the 613 mitzvos of the Torah. Tefillah is da'oraisa. Kriya Shema, of course, is da'oraisa, but Kriya Shema is not davening. Kriya Shema is not tefillah. Kriya Shema is affirmation. I mean, you understand the difference. I mean, it's all part of davening, I understand. But Kriya Shema is an affirmation of principles of faith. I affirm there's God. I affirm that I should love him and serve him. It's not davening. Tefillah is Shemona Esrei. Now, the Rambam says there's a mitzvah da'oraisa, not only to say the Shema, but there's a mitzvah da'oraisa called tefillah. Where does the Torah say there's a mitzvah of tefillah? So actually, it's derived from a verse in Shema. We say in V'hayam Shemoah, U'liyavdo b'chol levavachem. You shall serve Hashem with all of your heart. So the Rambam brings the Sifri. Ezohi avodah shebelev. What is service of the heart? Zeh tefillah. So the Rambam says the mitzvah of tefillah is the oraisa. So the question becomes, what does the Rambam mean? The mitzvah of tefillah is the oraisa. I thought it's from the Anshe Knesses Hagdola, augmented by Shimon HaPakuli. So what do you mean it's the oraisa? So the Rambam himself explains. The Rambam himself says the following. On a Torah level, you are obligated to pray to Hashem in your own words, in your own language, once every day. So the D'oraisa is to turn to Hashem in prayer once every day, and the words were your own words. Now, you can then ask, was there any structure that entailed? So some say yes. Some say that even when you were praying in your own words, there was a mandatory structure of paralleling what later became in Shemona Esrei, praise, request, and gratitude. So you would say, so a prayer could be, your davening for the day could be, Hashem, you are so great. Please give me health and parnasa, and I am grateful for all that you've given me. That would be the tefillah d'oraisa, and according to the Rambam, you are mechuyev to turn to God once a day in that prayer. And that applied even when there was Beis HaMikdash, etc., even though when there was Karbanis. So what did the Anshe Knesset Hagdola do? They did two things. Number one, they substituted for spontaneity of prayer a fixed liturgy, Shmona Esrei. And number two, they enacted that it occur several times a day, Shachris, Mincha. Now we'll talk later, Mariv is actually optional, but it's Shachris and Mincha. So which means, according to the Rambam, there are two layers of tefillah. Tefillah d'oraisa is once a day in your own words. Tefillah d'Rabbanan, let us say, is twice a day or three times a day, Mariv we'll see, with a fixed liturgy. But that is from the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, which would technically be only midrabanan. So there's d'oraisa tefillah, there's midrabanan tefillah, but of course, once you're doing the d'Rabbanan tefillah, then you are makayim the d'oraisa that way as well, because you're davening to Hashem. But it is two levels. Now, Ramban, Nachmanides, Ramban argues with the Rambam, and the Ramban actually says there is no obligation of daily prayer to Hashem. There is only an obligation of daily recitation of Shema, and when the Sifri darshans, U'li'avdo b'chol levavchem, Avodah shebelev zet tefillah, that's what's called an asmachta, meaning sometimes the Rabbanan just find a hint to their teaching in a pasuk, but it's not really what the pasuk is saying. And the Ramban says the only time there's an obligation to pray under Torah law is when you are faced with a tzara. In other words, if, God forbid, there's a real tzara, you're supposed to turn to God. But if life is going okay, there's no automatic obligation. Which means, according to Ramban, at least if there's not an tzara, there is not a two-tier layer, right? There's not a d'oraisa level of tefillah and then a rabbanan level of tefillah. Rather, the oraisa, the level is 0, and the Anshe Knesset Hagdola enacted a nusach kavua of tefillah that should be said at least twice a day. In other words, you're going from 0 to rabbanan, as opposed to Rambam, where there was a d'oraisa tefillah that got augmented by a takana d'Rabbanan. Okay, so this is a very important machlokas, the Rambam and the Ramban. We'll talk next time. The practice. There are actually nafkaminas in halacha between these different views regarding women's obligation to daven and the like. So, good day.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.